Well, hello and welcome to lesson 7.7, where we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the diencephalon. Now, the reason I'm producing this video lesson for you is to highlight a region of the brain that has proven over time to be one of the trickier areas to both identify and understand, and also because I know that in the future we're going to be studying and trying to roadmap the sensory motor pathway. And it turns out that the diencephalon specifically has a very important role in how your brain receives a stimulus and decides what to do, how to respond. So I wanted to make sure that we touched on this, giving you the best shot possible of fully comprehending its role and the way it ties in between sensory input coming through the spinal cord and integration happening up in the cerebrum. Okay. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in here with some of the basics of this. The diencephalon, as you have seen in diagrams, no doubt, is a region that sits on top of the brainstem. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not just like a specific part. It's a little different than like the cerebellum and the brainstem specifically, which are very unique structures. Oh, I should throw in the cerebrum too there. So the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem are all unique structures that you can tell just by looking at the brain where they begin and end. But the diencephalon is a little bit trickier than that in that it is a region within the brain and it can be kind of tricky to know where it begins and ends. And I'll try to point you in the right direction so that when we get to dissections and future diagrams, you can hopefully be pretty successful with locating it. At any rate, this particular part of the brain is enclosed or kind of wrapped up by the two cerebral hemispheres. So you can almost think about this as the core of the brain. And it's made of three specific parts: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Now, way back in your development, your brainstem and thalamus were some of the first pieces of your brain to start forming. In fact, if you look at this, this is from 13 weeks of development. A baby's brain looks a lot like this. You'll notice that the cerebrum is quite small. Really, it's not it's not that big, especially compared to like the brainstem here. These important autonomic regions of the brain and the thalamus. That thalamus is already forming early on. So the thalamus is kind of the core, this essential core of your brain, and the cerebral hemispheres just grow and expand around it and encapsulate it and close it completely. By the time you're an adult, this is kind of the progression here. You can see that we've got a nice big cerebral hemisphere which gives you lots of processing power. The cerebellum is fully developed as well. And yet the diencephalon is just kind of buried right there, hanging out in the very middle of the brain. We're looking deep into the brain here with this particular image, sitting right on top of the brainstem, that autonomic region that we'll cover in more detail down the road too. With a slice through the brain, we'd be able to start identifying some key parts and features. I can just orient you to this. This is an important thing. This big, thick structure right here is called the corpus callosum. You would have come across that in your brain essentials work. That's the band of neural tissue that connects the two sides, the two hemispheres, the two cerebral hemispheres. And just under that is this region. In our diagrams in the textbook and everything that you see here in my video lessons, the thalamus is represented as a purple region, this shaded purple area. Of course, there's three subdivisions: the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus, and we're going to get into those specifics as we go through this lesson here in just a little bit. Let's talk first about the thalamus, okay? Now, the thalamus is this region right here. It's sort of a oval-shaped area. When we dissect our sheep brains, it's going to be very easy for you to find this because it's kind of a light-colored circular area or oval-shaped area. When you make this cross section of the brain like this, or I guess it's more a medial section of the brain, you'll go right down the middle, and you should be able to see the thalamus with no trouble. It has a different texture than the rest of the brain tissue around it. The thalamus is pretty easy to spot. Let's identify what it does specifically. So I guess just to emphasize this, in our diagrams here, it's going to be that lighter purple kind of egg-shaped region right here that I highlighted in yellow for you. The thalamus is responsible for being a relay station for sensory impulses. In other words, sensory impulses come into the brain. They come in through sensory neurons into the spinal cord. They head up the spinal cord, and the first region of the brain that they hit is the thalamus. And the thalamus is going to basically sort out the type of stimulus that's coming in. Is it painful? Is it pleasant? Is it something you need to take action on? Is it something that you can ignore? And essentially, it transfers this impulse to the correct part of the cortex so that your brain can interpret what's going on. It reminds me of a really old job. I'm going to go ahead and put this picture up here. Back in like the 1920s, turn of the century, as telephones became commonplace, there were these things called switchboards, and I don't know if you recognize this or not, but there actually was a person whom you would call kind of as a central hub, and the person on the other end of the line, the secretary essentially would ask how they could direct your call. And you'd say, well, I want to call so and so, or I want to call this number. And they would patch you through by literally picking up these little wires, these cables, and connecting your phone line on this switchboard to whoever you wanted to call. And they would ring that person, and then you'd be able to have that conversation. So this happened all manually. And I think of the thalamus kind of like a switchboard operator. Incoming signal comes in, the thalamus says, oh, you need to go here or here or here, and then they patch that signal through by sending a signal onto a certain region of the cerebrum, which is pretty phenomenal in my opinion, that it can comprehend all that. So things like visual stimuli, any sort of sensory stimuli like touch, pain, temperature, all those sorts of things. These all, oh, auditory, that comes in here as well. All of these impulses, the sensory impulses, head to the thalamus first, and from the thalamus, you can see these radiating. Well, it's kind of just mocked up here in this diagram. This doesn't exactly show you how the neurons connect, but essentially the neurons radiate out from the thalamus to the far reaches of the cerebrum, and your brain is able to process then according to the specific region of the brain. Like back here, for example, is where you process your visual stimuli. Right here in this area is where you process the auditory impulses. Right here, that's where you're processing sensory information, and other things have to do with visual and memory and thoughts and all these sorts of things. So the thalamus really just sends the signal wherever it should go, kind of pigeonholes it to the right location of the brain, so your brain's not flooded with unnecessary information. Next region to talk about is the hypothalamus. Now this sits directly under the thalamus. I'm going to go ahead and show you a picture here and highlight the thalamus. There it is. So thinking about the orientation, this is the anterior direction, so forward facing. This is posterior back here. If that's your thalamus area, the hypothalamus is just underneath that in the anterior direction. And one just notable feature is that this is where your pituitary gland connects. So when we do get to our sheep brain dissection, we'll be able to locate that pituitary gland right away. That's pretty easy to find. And that gives you a sense of where the hypothalamus is or was, depending on how you end up making your dissection. Let's process what the hypothalamus does, okay? This is a very, very important autonomic nervous system center. This particular center or region of the brain helps regulate your body temperature and make sure that that autonomic responses occur if you get too cold or if you get too warm. This also controls water balance, so the fluid balance in your bloodstream, which is really important. It also regulates metabolism, which is a really interesting side note all in of itself. We won't get into that specifically, but your metabolism, of course, does change with life. So that's regulated by the hypothalamus, and it also is the center for emotions, so something referred to as the limbic center. So when we think about emotional responses to something that you see or hear or think about, the hypothalamus is responsible for the nervous signals that give you those emotions, good, bad, and ugly. Okay. The pituitary gland is also regulated by this. I guess I should probably have made that a red thing in terms of a function. So if you're taking notes there and highlighting stuff, why don't you go ahead and highlight that as well? Controls the pituitary gland, which also has its feelers in your metabolism and your growth and that sort of thing. So these parts of the brain are all tied together with how you grow and develop and feel things. The hypothalamus specifically does produce two hormones of its own. You are not responsible for knowing those, so we're just going to gloss over that and keep on going. But make sure you do highlight that statement that it regulates the nearby pituitary gland. I'm going to probably get that highlighted for the next time I use this presentation. On to the next region is the epithalamus. You can highlight that as well. Looks like I missed that in red. Here's the epithalamus. It is the trickiest one to find. The epithalamus is just right back here. It's kind of behind or to the posterior of the thalamus, or like right on top of the thalamus. When we dissect our sheep brains, you'll be able to locate the pineal gland specifically. That gives you a good landmark because it's a different color, a different shape, and a different texture. So it really helps you identify that, oh yeah, the epithalamus is right there, in that region. The epithalamus is responsible for housing this pineal gland, which is an endocrine gland. We won't get into those specifics right now. What I want to focus on, though, is that it does form cerebral spinal fluid, which is something that we're going to talk about in, I believe, actually the next lesson as we think about protective features of the brain and spinal cord. The cerebral spinal fluid offers a protective cushion for the brain and spinal cord, also brings nutrients, all sorts of things. It's a really fascinating feature, I guess, of the brain and spinal cord. And it's strange to think about, but this fluid is forming deep inside your brain. It kind of creates this watery sort of pocket, this little pool of fluid inside the middle of the brain, and that's circulated both within and all around the brain and spinal cord, which is pretty amazing. Okay, with that, that is a wrap here. I wanted to again just highlight those three regions, give you a sense of what each part of the diencephalon does so that you can track this better as we move to the sensory motor pathway. But if you have any questions about this, if I've glossed over things too quickly or you want to hear some clarification, don't hesitate to reach out. Be happy to give you some assistance with that. Other than that, I think that's a wrap. We'll just keep this nice and short and sweet and to the point. So thank you for watching, and let me know if you need any help with this. Okay?